We have successfully made it into 2024. We have survived the darkest night of the year, which means we can start looking forward to longer days, which means more reading. A new year is the perfect time to start laying some plans, figure out what we're going to do about all those books stacking up. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and like I said, it's a new year, it's a new month, it's a new bright day, and therefore it's time to figure out what we're going to do this year, what we're going to read. So today is less of a let's talk about a book episode and more a so what are we going to be doing with the podcast this year? What have I done in the last year that I want to continue doing when it comes to reading? So in a sense, you've been invited to an admin meeting. Apologies for that. I'm going to keep it short but sweet today. I really want to give you a quick update of where I want to go with the podcast and also ruminate about my reading from the last year and things I might want to change next year when it comes to my literary diet. As always, I hope that you join me for the journey. Let's get the organizatory things out of the way first. It's always best to start with the thing you enjoy least, I think. That's how I approach food and many other things in life. Anyway, as you've maybe noticed, in December, there were only 2 episodes. I noticed that during the last few months of the year, I was kind of struggling keeping up with the weekly posting, but also then keeping the quality intact. And I didn't want to give anyone rushed episodes or have the feeling that after I uploaded it that there were so many more things I might have wanted to say if I just had maybe an extra hour or 3 or maybe even a day or 4 to think about it a little bit more. So what I'll be doing is I'll have at least 2 episodes a month. They'll come out every 2 weeks. Every 3rd episode will remain a Let's Get Medieval episode, but there's going to be a bit more of a gap between them to give me a little bit more time to give you proper quality. Should be enough of a backlog to keep new listeners at least a little bit entertained. And of course, if inspiration does strike, I'll be right there with a new episode anyway. So who knows? There might be extra episodes anyway, but there will be at least 1 every 2 weeks. And that way, hopefully, I'll be able to keep the quality where I want it to be, give you a proper deep dive into certain aspects of the books, of the poems, of the short stories, whatever they may be. And I hope you then enjoy those. That's, of course, the hope. Well, I think that's the organizatory stuff out of the way. It's excellent when it happens like that. It's very windy here, so I don't know if you can hear the kind of ghoulish knocking of branches against my window. If not, then you're missing out. And if yes, I hope it is adding to the ambience for you too. So now that I've kind of informed you about what my plans are when it comes to uploading episodes for the next year, it is probably also worth sharing what I'm hoping to read. It can be difficult creating resolutions for yourself for a new year. I always find that the pressure of having to make a resolution and then stick to it, especially through the month of January, which is the hardest month to try and stick to anything because it's the beginning of a new year, but the weather still is a bit crappy and you have to go back to work all of a sudden after that kind of liminal zone of the holidays. It's hard to stick with resolutions, is what I'm trying to say. But I do have a few reading ones. As always, I have a reading goal for myself, which is 100 books a year. I've had this goal for years, and it's only really in the last 2 years that I've managed to meet that target, in part because I read a lot for work, and I now also, because I have a steady job, I find I suddenly have a better balance between reading in my private time and reading for work. So I've actually managed to reach these goals. I've once again set 100 books as my target for 2024, so there should be plenty of material to cover with y'all. But I do have some other little goals in there as well. As I've kind of hinted at or just plainly explicitly stated in previous episodes, I am half Dutch, half German, and yet I do most of my reading in English. And it has been pointed out to me that that's maybe not necessarily a flaw or a mistake, but that I am missing a lot of excellent literature. And that is absolutely true. Even the big classics from especially the German literary scene I read in English if I did read them. So one of my goals for the coming year is to read more German and Dutch literature in those languages themselves. So potentially, most likely, you'll be getting an episode on some of that in the future. Alongside that, I also want to try and read a little bit more speculative fiction. I read a lot of sci-fi as is, which often falls under the speculative umbrella, but I want to kind of focus a little bit more explicitly on books that just speculate, that go wild, maybe also books that are a little bit more meta. I'm currently reading The House of Leaves, and that is very much a book that plays with the concept of what is a book, what is a story, what is reading, what does the act of reading do, what are you looking at? And I enjoy getting my mind played with like that. So I want to be a little bit more inventive in my reading in the coming year. I would, of course, also very much like to hear what you're reading, what your potential reading goals are, if you do have them, and if there's anything you would like me to read or cover on the podcast. I'm always here for recommendations. And then there is something else I want to cover, which is maybe a little bit self-obsessed. I don't know if that's the right word, but it is about me and about my reading. So in a sense, well, technically it is a bit self-obsessed. But for ages, I used Goodreads to kind of track my reading. And I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of that platform. And a friend had recommended Storygraph towards the end of last year, and I started using it. And one of my favorite things that the app does is kind of give you these little statistics about your reading. Before I go into the statistics, another reminder that this is not an ad. No one pays for this podcast. I hardly pay for it. So don't think that this is an ad. This is just me being intrigued by numbers. One of the things that Storygraph can tell me is, for example, the page numbers, but especially also the genre breakdown and to what extent the books that I read have a fast or a slow pace. It turns out literally most of my reading, well, almost of my reading, 57% to be exact, is a medium pace. And that just has me wondering, what does that even mean? None of the books I've read have made me go, well, this is very medium. So perhaps my attention to that is not on point. But I found that a very interesting statistic. And out of the 100 books that I read last year, a good fifth was apparently an adventurous mood. And that is probably very true. I think considering how much fantasy and science fiction I read, that is most often catalogued as adventurous. Therefore, that makes a lot of sense. But then my second biggest category of mood was dark. And that really did make me wonder whether I'd been reading depressing books and if that could explain anything about how I'd been feeling. I think the relationship we have with our reading can be very reciprocal. If a book is sad, you'll feel a little bit sad, but I do think afterwards you might feel better. So yeah, I found that very interesting, and you'll be pleased to know that the smallest categories in my little mood graph here are the categories sad and inspiring, which also made me giggle, as you just heard. Aside from that, apparently I like to read mainly books between 300 and 500 pages, which again strikes me as very true. And my nonfiction quota is very small, so that's also fair. Fantasy is the biggest genre I read. Next to that, though, is literary. I'm not quite sure still what the genre of literary fiction encompasses, but that was next. Then there's thrillers, and then there's young adult, but then there's horror. So I think I'm keeping it kind of open, kind of varied. But I did realize there's a lot more magical realism and speculative fiction I could be reading. None of the books I read were apparently marked as feminist, which I find interesting. I may need to go and edit some of those categories. Aside from that, I just find it very interesting to see my reading in a kind of quantitative way and to kind of see it laid out in different graphs and pie charts and lists and to get an idea of, hey, so that's what's going on. That's how we've been stacking up. With all of that attention on my reading, though, and looking into all of those different aspects of my reading over the year, I did realize that I didn't have a standout favorite book this year. Quite often, by the time we get towards mid-December, I try to come up with a bit of a list for myself. What were my favorite books this year? Which book really hit home with me? Which book really opened my eyes, etc.? And none of them really stood out. And I don't know if that's maybe because I was too distracted this year. Maybe I didn't invest enough in any of the books. I read plenty of books that I really enjoyed. And a lot of those books I also shared on the podcast with you, either in the What We Read sections or in separate episodes. But there was nothing that really made me go, wow, I need to be recommending this book to everyone. And I have had reading experiences like that. A year or two ago, it was The Actual Star by Monica Byrne, which I adored and tried to get as many people as possible to read. And another was The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, which I have successfully recommended to multiple people. And I've made them read it and they've loved it and also been sad by it. But yeah, nothing really stood out last year. And that's a bit of a shame. Maybe if I just let them all sink in a little bit more, a favorite will emerge. But for now, I think that 2023, I can leave most of those books behind, enjoy the time I had with them, but also let them go and prepare for a new year full of reading. I am currently reading quite a bit. I've got a number of books lined up, and one of them is a Japanese thriller, which I'm hoping to share with you for the full episode next week. So I should probably make an end to this so that I can keep reading. I hope you had an excellent holiday period. And as we say in Germany, I hope you had a good slide into the new year. And I look forward to sharing more books with you in the coming 12 months. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.